Afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good evening from the UK, Europe, and the Middle East. And I don't know about saying good night. That sounds like it's over. But thanks very much for the folks in India and also in Indonesia for tuning in so late. Really appreciate it. Today I've got Peter Batrowny with me, and we're going to be talking about a subject that, well, to say it's near and dear to my heart's a bit of an understatement. It was the first 10, 15 years of my career in health and safety was working with first line supervisors. So the reason we're on this show today, everybody, is not to try to get Peter to establish that the first line supervisor is the key to so many things. But what do you do about it? I mean, it's a given, but what is it that actually works out there? So, Peter, first of all, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Larry. Thanks for having me. I think it's going to be a good conversation.
Well, I mean, you and I, we whenever we talk, we end up talking for so long about different things that work, don't work. Some of the difficulties and the struggles that companies have had. But Peter, if you could maybe just tell us just a bit about your background in terms of working and engaging with first line supervisors, trying to improve them when you were the top safety person at AES. And for those of you listening, I'll get Peter maybe to just give us a brief elevator speech on AES. I'm not sure if it originally started with American Electric Systems, but it's a global electrical company now. And we even had Peter's former associate counterpart, Amir in the Netherlands, on one of our Safe Connection shows. So, but Peter, tell us a bit about what you did when you were with AES, and then I'll get you to tell us a bit about your private business, and then segue to working with us with Safe Lead and everything. But I think you've spent as much time in the trenches as I have, for good or bad. So give us a bit of how it all started for you.
I look at the time in the trenches as a good thing, Larry. And just a real quick overview of the experience we had with frontline supervisors. Specifically at AES, we were a group of us working on developing, what we were calling a world-class safety culture, which I know a lot of the folks on the phone are going to be familiar with that exercise, that never-ending exercise, I should say. And when we first started out, we were really focusing on kind of the senior level of leadership and making sure that the strategies, visions were aligned, and I think we did a really good job at that. And we also did a fair amount of focusing on the front lines, where we all know that's where the hazardous energy is. That's where folks are coming in contact with, potentially serious incidents. And what we really overlooked initially was the value, the power, if you will, of those frontline supervisors and the really, really important role they have. And, and you and I have talked about this a lot, Larry. It's not just the safety elements of the operation of a business, but all elements of it. And so, once we had that epiphany that, really need to engage and see what skills the frontline supervisors need to reinforce or maybe need to develop, it was really a pivotal point, I think, in the development of that culture and, really getting it in some positive momentum and working in the right direction. So I think it was that realization of how important the frontline supervisors were. And then once we started that engagement, it really bore fruit. So it was really worthwhile effort to engage and work with those frontline supervisors.
Could you give us, Peter, just an idea of the scope or the size, the scale of that effort at AES? Like how many supervisors, how many hours of training or coaching? I mean, I don't want to assume it was all training, but how when one tries to get their hands around this, like you guys did, how big was this, that you were?
As you know, it's a global company, and it was a relatively big effort. I don't know the exact number of supervisors that we, engaged at the time, but it was a lot. It was, almost every continent. We tried to reach every leader for some point, and I believe the training. I'm going by memory, but it was between 4 to 6 hours of kind of classroom type training, going over principles that everybody agrees is valuable as a leader, but also follow up in the field, leaders mentoring, and looking out for each other to develop and work on the skills that we talked about.
Right, right. Okay, so a combination of both some classroom training and also some follow up, or in the field, on the floor, whatever you want to call it, type of activities as well.
Correct.
Okay, okay. Um, when I think I've told you this story before, Peter, but we were, I don't know, 8 years, 9 years into it on the market with Safe Start, and I was at the National Safety Council or American Society of Safety Professionals or VPPA trade, one of the national conferences, and I was walking through the trade show with Gary Higby. Many of you know of Gary. He co-authored the first book, Inside Out, with me, first Safe Start customer, John Deere, all that. Good and very long time good friend. And we're walking down the aisle, and Gary says to me, Larry, you know as well as I do that the first line supervisor is key to everything, and Safe Start's going to be no different. We need to have something for the first line supervisor. And kind of candidly, because I knew where we were in the trade show and I'd walked the floor before, and I said, well, Gary, we'll just turn around the next corner and I'll take you down the aisle and show you the tombstones of some of the supervisory training programs for health and safety that are all dead and gone now. I don't even know if some of these guys are even going to have them on display. They might be in their catalog. And I said, sadly enough, I was the editor for some of these things, Gary. Some of them that I was the editor are still kicking around. This was, a while back, but I mean, there's been a lot of attempts at trying to, solve this first line supervisor training program. And for my money, anyhow, Peter, and I know you and I've talked about this, I know it's inconvenient to have to train first line supervisors because you got to backfill them and so on. But I believe the reason it doesn't go on more often isn't because it isn't convenient or that they have to overcome some inconvenience or scheduling issues. I believe it's because they weren't getting enough out of it compared to how much effort it was to do the training. I don't think the expense was an issue really necessarily. It could be in some instances, but I think it was that just the net result just wasn't there. They just weren't, getting what they needed to out of this training, information, education, etc. So when I've never asked you this before, but what made you decide to kind of go out on your own and make, from AES and make this a business?
Well, it was just a convenient time for me to move on, Larry. And, I've always had a passion for, doing this type of training, doing consulting, and saw an opportunity to help and get experience in, a wider variety of industries. So it was just a convenient time for me to kind of strike out on my own. But I will say,
you must have thought you were pretty good at it too, Peter. I mean, this is not, going out into this kind of a business is not for the faint of heart. Like you don't sail across the ocean in a little boat if you don't think you can sail. No, not a. I mean, I know. You wouldn't, and I wouldn't necessarily just say, "Oh, you go try it too," right? You go coach first line supervisors. It's not as easy as you might think. That's for sure. But if you can do it, the dividends are tremendous. I mean, it's huge. I mean, there's limitation. We can talk about that too. There's, you can't keep somebody's balance for them, for instance. But How many years ago was, I don't want to say how many years ago, Peter, but how many years have you been doing this then, in terms of coaching first line supervisors and trying to help them, develop and improve?
Well, I really don't want to say, Larry, it's been that long, but I think that my experience in coaching frontline, actually being a frontline leader, starting to coach frontline leaders, started in the military
Right.
a while back. I also had experience in healthcare. I don't think you and I have ever talked about that. Might be a
No, no, I know.
separate discussion. And then, I worked in industry for many years, so it's been, most of my adult career, I've been in one form or another, either a frontline supervisor myself, or in a role where coaching and mentoring frontline supervisors was imperative, and worked in military and healthcare, as is somewhat of a hierarchy system, and actually saw evolution in those as well, right? And an evolution in industry in general, going from that more hierarchical structure to being flatter, and even increases the importance of having frontline supervisors with the requisite skills to have a successful business or successful organization.
Yeah, I would agree that as the layers got less and the companies got flatter, obviously each layer is going to carry more load. I mean, but um, you're back again to that. Even with the layers, you've always got the rubber. Where the rubber meets the road is where everything will or won't get traction, right? I mean, and having worked with supervisors and then being able to see the result in terms of the traction with the different crews and the different, even different divisions within companies and things like that, it was really obvious to me too, though, that in a void by itself, the first line supervisors quite often were really struggling. In other words, and I want to make sure we talk a bit about that as well too, Peter, in terms of, the support from above. I suppose it's one of the things people can always sort of nicely default to and sort of, blame upper leadership or whatever. But certainly without any upper leadership support, you're really in a difficult position sometimes as that first line supervisor. But Peter, just before we get right into it, in terms of classroom training in the field, what works, and more of the nitty gritty, was about what 6 years ago that you started working with us in the development of Safe Lead. Maybe it was only 4 or 5. I don't know.
It was about 3.5 years ago, something like that, Larry.
Yeah. Well, time does seem like it's taking a lot longer now with COVID. I don't know if I'm nearly as accurate in terms of how much time goes by or hasn't gone by over the last few years, sadly enough. But 3 or 4 years then. So tell us a bit about that, and sort of how that all got to be, if you will, and then we'll move into the heart of the matter, if you will.
You're talking about the Safe Lead, Larry?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So as I when I worked at AES, we were clients of Safe Start, and got to know some of the folks that were there. And when I was started working on my own as an independent consultant, I was approached to kind of take a look at different aspects of the Safe Lead training, and see what what modules were important, and actually looked at the details of what material we were going to include, and how it was going to be presented, how success was going to be measured, those types of things.
Oh, okay.
And then I was involved with of course, with the pilots when we first, got the program together. I was involved with implementing some of the pilot sites, and then some of the, if you will, the mid-course corrections to what we learned from the pilot implementations.
Yeah. Well, adjustments as you go through,
and those are going to be continual, I would assume, right?
Well, always. Well, I mean, there's two things. There's one of them is, you realize some of the things you did that weren't so good, even basic typos. So you got to fix that up. And then there's other things where you've had an aha or an insight, and you really want to think, this shouldn't be left out here. So where do we put it in? And in some cases it isn't perfectly graceful, but nevertheless, I remember Jack talking to me about the thing, but the pre-state, saying, like, Larry, it's important. You can't leave this till the end, just because it's not that easy for you to fit it in somewhere. I mean, people need to know this stuff quickly. By the way, I could have told you after you got hurt, kind of thing. Okay, so you've been working with us now for a while, Peter. Working with supervisors for even longer. We'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
But in terms of the 10,000 hours or whatever that benchmark is, you and I passed that a long time ago. And yet I would never, when it comes to interpersonal communication, especially first line supervisors, I would never want to call myself an expert. I would like to say I can give it a good shot. I've had a good track record. The odds are good if you hire me, but expert, when it comes to people, human behavior, there's such a range of skills and abilities within those first line supervisors. Some skills and abilities that I've never seen with senior leaders, no matter how far up the organization you go. And some of them in terms of caring that, you'd get from a parent or a close relative. So, some phenomenal strengths. But let's real bare bones before we get into strengths, weaknesses, and what should you focus on. Let's just talk about the classroom versus one-on-one training, or as you said, combining the two of them. Just take off wherever you'd like, Peter. I've done all of it as well too, and there's some efficiencies in classroom training, but there's some real potential problems, especially as you try to roll this out en masse within a big company, like using your own folks and stuff like that versus always having the outside guy. So just tell us about it from your perspective at AES, and then also your perspective as a private consultant, the classroom, the one-on-one, the combination, and what's worked, what doesn't, and what would you recommend?
Well, I think that, number one, you hit the nail right on the head, Larry. As far as efficiency, I think that a classroom setting of, 15 to 20 folks, there are some concepts that you can get across in that type of setting. You can talk about theories like how to give feedback and how to have difficult conversations. But I think that, looking at the development of an individual leader more holistically, you really have to spend that one-on-one time. And, there's no off-the-shelf solution. You and I talk about this all the time. It really has to be something that you can tailor not only to the organization, but also to the individual. And I think that's where the value of the smaller groups or the one-on-one coaching really comes into play. You can talk about the value of giving specific feedback versus positive feedback and negative feedback, et cetera. But then you've got to really understand the individual leader's personality a little bit. And we talked about this last night when we were chatting. Some people might be outgoing and they're going to have a different methodology for providing feedback. Someone that's a little bit more reserved is going to have a little bit different style of providing feedback. And I think that's where the value of the one-on-one and small group sessions comes in for true coaching, to really help that individual be the best the best that he can be, right? Not the best leader, but the best leader within the, the confines, if you will, of his personality, his strengths or her strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, now when there are obviously the overkill in the classroom too, Peter, right? In other words, even if it's a good instructor and the material is good, well presented, there is a certain amount of basic stuff when it comes to talking to people and feedback and so on that isn't rocket science, I guess, to anybody, whether you've first line supervisor, Harvard, graduate kind of thing. I mean, and a great deal of it you should have learned in kindergarten too, in terms of, listen, be polite, nice, and all that sort of stuff too, right? Which is kind of hard to teach, especially, grown men in rough and tumble industries, right? But obviously, if the person you're talking to doesn't believe you sincerely care, then they're not likely going to sincerely listen. That's pretty straightforward too. So if somebody is listening to this show with hoping to get a few ideas at least about what to do or what not to do, could you give us sort of some, like, if somebody gave you carte blanche to design their supervisory training program, what would be the maximum amount of classroom time that you would look at, or what would be the intervals in the classroom time so that you weren't becoming counterproductive with that? Because they're not all thrilled about being, to put it bluntly, everybody, they're not all thrilled about being in the classroom. And that means you have to be particularly thrilling one way or another in terms of value, entertainment, humor, you name it, probably a combination of all of it. But you got to make sure that they feel their time is being well spent. So what should people be looking at, Peter?
Well, I think I would look at it from a point of view of, from a holistic point of view, start out with, what you think good looks like. What kind of skills are you trying to impart on the leader? And to get more directly at your question, Larry, I think that the most valuable coaching takes place out on the shop floor, if you will, or out, where the rubber hits the road. And I would try to maximize that. And not only are you going to have, I think, better outcomes or better interactions with the individuals, it's going to make it more sustainable. Right? You and I are not naive enough, and our listeners aren't naive enough to think that you're going to put someone through X number of hours of classroom training or even small group pointed coaching sessions and think that this is going to be sustainable. I think the real value of it is to have that view of what good looks like, what skills are you trying to strengthen with the individual, what skills are you trying to kind of bolster with the individual, and have a plan for doing it in real time. Observing the leaders interacting with their direct reports, for example, and then giving some specific pointed feedback afterwards, or even having a discussion about what went well or what could you do better, and sharing that with others. So, I don't think that there's a real formula for number of hours in the classroom versus number of hours out in the field, but I would lean whatever capabilities building program you're putting together more towards field work and real-time conversations, real-time observations of leaders interacting with their direct reports, with their peers, and even with their leaders for that matter. Because as we know, to be a good leader, it's not just how you interact with your direct reports, it's how you interact with your peers, how you interact with your leaders as well, how you kind of fit into the organization. So I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, Larry, but.
Well, I mean, I understand your hesitation in terms of trying to throw out hard numbers too, Peter. I mean, in other words, like, I don't know, I can't say it's 4 hours of classroom training and 2 times 2 2 hour one-on-one sessions out in the field. I can say that's probably going to get you 2/3 to 3/4 of the folks, that'll probably be about right, maybe, but you never know what you're dealing with. I mean, I can remember going to some places, and this is years and years ago. So you've got, two things going against you. You've got a culture in a lot of the forest products or, oil and gas upstream where safety was just becoming a value. And you've got a new consultant, me, who doesn't really know what you're doing. And so you're not really turning down a lot of work. So, you'll start taking things on and realize that wasn't nearly enough time. But I used to make jokes of, you'd go to some places and say, gosh, you'd need 3 full-time genies and all 9 wishes to fix this place. I'm just an apprentice genie, so like you get 1 wish and don't pick anything too big, because I got 1 trick, and that is I seem to do okay with these first-line supervisors. It was 2 days of classroom training, and it was 2 usually one-on-one sessions. If I got the second one, which always wasn't there, and I know you've heard me say this so many times, Peter, I would have said anything. They got probably 5 times more value out of that 1 hour one-on-one. The supervisors did, and I did, than anybody got out of the classroom thing. And I was getting 9s and 10s across the board, sometimes straight 10s across the board on the evaluations after the 2-day workshop. So it wasn't like the people resented being in the class for 2 days. I mean, they were all cool with that. But in terms of just like give me an hour with that person one-on-one, even sometimes just that 20 minutes where we had the cup of coffee, and you got to see the world through his or her eyes. And that's, you never get that at the front of the room, not anywhere close to that level of precision. And so then what you can do, I think, can be much more, I don't want to say we're like a doctor. I'm not trying to make that parallel, but the diagnosis is much more accurate. And so what you can do to help them now becomes much more specific and usually much more valuable. So let me get to the next part here, which I think is where a lot of companies maybe go wrong. And I mean, I found this kind of just trial and error, but what would you recommend, Peter, that the emphasis when you're in the one-on-one part, where like the company's provided this, I think it's important we get across to everybody. Don't just buy a classroom solution from anybody. If you can buy one that includes some one-on-one consulting and coaching, and for heaven's sakes, demo that to make sure that you're not inviting problems out on the shop floor that are going to become, contested arguments, obviously. But make sure you've got some one-on-one opportunities built into your improvement plan. Like don't just leave it as classroom. Now, when you've got the person one-on-one, Peter, is it better to focus on strengths building and helping them develop what they're good at, have natural talent and aptitude for? Or are you better to be just spending your time, and this is what I see, spending all of your time at some companies just trying to shore up weaknesses, and saying in some cases, I guess that, well, these are liabilities, or these are legal liabilities, so we have to do it, but never any effort to look at what this person does well and getting them to do more of that more often. So
Yeah,
go ahead. No,
I was going to say, Larry, I think that you're touching on a very, very good point, and I believe it's a healthy combination of both. But I think that if people have strengths, you certainly want to work on those, and not only to make that individual a better leader, but that leader can share those strengths, or use those strengths to maybe help other leaders shore up their weaknesses, if you will. So I think that it's got to be a healthy combination of both. But I think leaning more towards taking advantage of a leader's strengths, you're going to get some more immediate immediate benefits from that approach, I believe.
Well, I remember guys like say to me, I wish I could like just stand up and talk like you, like I hate doing these safety meetings, and I get so nervous, and then everybody can see that I'm nervous and they feel bad for me, but like it's so he feels like he's I don't know, he loses respect from the crew because of the things that I'm not very good at. And I said, well, why don't you just get one of the people in your crew? Like, I can't remember the guy's name. I think it was Mike, actually. Sorry, Mike. Mike's the IT producer for our show here. I was supposed to introduce him earlier, and he's the one asking for the chat questions. And he's going to put them on the screen for Peter and I in a few minutes. It just sorry, just reminded me now. I did have it in big letters on the notes, Mike. But anyhow, he's our show producer. But I said, get this guy. I think his name was Mike. He said, just get Mike. He's like, I don't think he's shy at all. He'd be happy to sort of go through the items for the safety meetings and the things like that. I said, get everybody more engaged. And certainly, there's no, if you want to learn to become a better public speaker, you can start going to Toastmasters, but it's not a short journey. I mean, especially for folks who don't have a lot of natural aptitude. So, if you really want to, yeah, you can. But in the meantime, let's look at what you do well. When you're out there coaching these guys, especially with your trade, like he was a welder. I mean, you watch these guys, they're just eating it up. I said, you need to be spending your time doing that with them. I said, you're going to get so much further. So that's what I would try to get them working on what they were good at and spending more of their time doing what they were good at. And, I know dishing off the things that they could delegate to other people wherever it was possible. But you might, Peter, I mean, you might want to talk about some of the bare minimum stuff, like either at AES or in your own practice, though, in terms of weaknesses that do need to be shored up. I'm not trying to like say that you can fix the whole world with rainbows and sunshine and white puffy clouds either. So I've been at places too where I realized that the supervisor I was working with couldn't read and write. How he got where he was, I don't know. But that's a fair liability in terms of, things coming in that need to be communicated, so what about, where it is a real liability? Where did you guys draw the line? And could you give our listeners even a dotted line, maybe, Peter? I know you don't like hard lines.
I think that, from a, kind of a general standpoint, Larry, leaders, you need a certain amount of technical ability, technical strength. When in a safety world, from a safety standpoint, you want to be able to, be an effective manager of risk. So you have to be able to identify risk, whether it's, unsafe conditions, unsafe behaviors. So I think there's kind of, a floor, if you will. You've got to be able to identify and manage risk. Some of the other things from my perspective, to be a good leader, you have to have certain basic communication skills, like being a good listener, for example, and what exactly that means. So, there's another, I think, kind of a minimum entry, if you will, is to be a good listener. The other thing would be to, within your own style and your own personality, be a good communicator as well. You have to be able to, articulate your expectations, your organization's expectations. So you have to have a certain amount of communication skills, if you will. And then there's the some of the other things that you and I talk about from time to time. The other technical skills, reporting skills, managerial skills, those types of things. So and the other thing that I would do, Larry, is with any organization before they start, is to sit down and kind of catalog these skills that the leadership of a business or an organization believes is going to be important for them, and then they can maybe prioritize which skills they're going to require for an entry level leader, and which ones they're willing to develop. And I think the other thing that you and I have talked about this a few times, Larry, is don't wait until the leader gets promoted before you start developing these skills. There's a huge amount of value in identifying high potential leaders, while they're working maybe as an operator or in maintenance or whatever they're an engineer, whatever that person's technical job is, and start identifying and imparting those skills, the risk management skills, communication skills, giving feedback, those types of things before the person becomes a leader. Don't wait until they get promoted and then kind of have to scramble to get those skills built up to a minimum.
Well, let's just spend a minute or two, Peter, talking about this, because you and I've talked about this extensively. It's that accept it as a given, maybe I don't have to like it, but if you've got a first line supervisor that has all of the skills, drives, and ability, the chances are that person will be promoted very quickly. And so the joke I used to make is you don't find a lot of 7-foot guys on the junior varsity basketball team, right? They're all on the varsity basketball team because they're 7 feet tall, and likely they're going to be going places. So the companies do poach their own ranks. That's a given, right? But what kind of gets left behind then isn't necessarily always fair in terms of aptitude and ability, but sometimes it was pedigree or degree that the person had enough better that got promoted. And so you've got some real talent that does get left behind, but you've also got some deadwood that gets left behind as well. And so how do you, obviously there's sort of a event like you'd like to get rid of the dead wood and bring on new good wood with potential. Anything that you could, it's a difficult area, but do you try to help companies at all with that as well too? Or is it just, again, trying to shore up the liabilities, build up the strengths, everybody's got some, and try not to get too into the selection process, or who we could draft onto the squad, if you will?
Yeah, I think I have had those conversations with leaders before, Larry, and I think that some of the leaders that I've talked to, they understand that folks that are on their team, it's kind of cliche, but we've all got to be rowing the boat in the same direction. And if somebody's rowing countercurrent, you've got to do your best to try to get that person in alignment with your vision, with your strategies, and get them in that direction. And I think that we talk about this all the time. I think that basically people want to do the right thing, and with the right amount of coaching and the right amount of discussion, you can get everybody rowing in the same direction. And it's very, very, very rare when you have to kind of replace that wood, if you will. It's more of a, maybe using your analogy, a different coat of varnish or something else that can get that person going in the right direction.
I mean, this is worst case example. I remember going, I mean, there was little, I don't know how to put this politely, but there's the number one injury was pulling carts instead of pushing carts, and eventually over the years you hurt your shoulders. And I was there, I saw anybody pushing in a cart, and I said something about the supervision, and they said, "Oh yeah, but the really bad ones, we just make them work the night shift, and we hope that that'll make them quit." So that their whole strategy was, we get rid of the bad supervisors, we make them work the night shift and hope they quit. But I said, "Well, how's that working?" And they said, "Well, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they like the night shift and they're there forever." And I was just like, "Oh my gosh," I mean, so I know I'm not saying there's any easy solutions to getting new talent into that first line supervisor group too, but I think there's another point where you've got to be realistic about, whether somebody should or shouldn't have got that job in the first place, who knows, but that they should be able to keep it with that skill set or those abilities and that amount of drive is certainly not questionable. But as an outside person, I rarely wanted to ever get too involved with any of that stuff at all, because it always seemed like it was a quagmire that you could be getting into, and you never know who's telling you the truth always and stuff. But back to the strengths builder and the shoring up the weaknesses stuff, Peter. Again, how much making sure the first line supervisors understand the law, the bare minimum. I mean, that's pretty boring stuff. And it's also basic stuff, talking to them in the classroom about being a good listener and being effective communicator. In other words, making sure that when you're giving direction, those directions were understood clearly, whether it's say back communication or tell me what you think I just told you to do, or could you please repeat how you're going to lock that out to me again? I mean, all of those things are difficult with a classroom setting, to breathe life into it, but I think it's all essential. And it's obviously very difficult, especially on any kind of repeated basis, to be teaching people about the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the law. So could you give us sort of a recommendation or a minimum or something that somebody could kind of go, okay, I think we're on the right track, or I think probably he's right, we need to do a bit more of that a little more regularly?
I'm thinking about this as you asked the question, Larry, and I think that one of the things that occurred to me when we were discussing before is that one of the things that I see businesses do that may be an opportunity for improvement is to front end that classroom training. And the other thing you have to think about is people's attention spans, right? If you have to give 8 hours of training and you do it in a 1 or 2 day period, how much realistically are people going to retain from that, or can you space it out over time? And so I think that balancing the person or the groups or the individual's attention span, maybe an hour, 90 minutes at the top's worth of kind of a classroom setting, or sharing theory, and balance that with some practice and real-time coaching in the interim, I think is probably the best formula that I've seen.
It's easy. If you make it half a day, you got back like a lot of backfill issues too. I mean, like the thing is that you can't have unsupervised work out there. I mean, it legally defaults to the person, I think, with the most seniority, but that may or may not, that person may have no preparation at all for what they're up against, or aptitude, training, ability, etc. It's a difficult thing for companies to take supervisors off the floor for half a day, but for an hour, they could probably get the previous shift to stay over for an hour or something like that. That's a little more manageable. And I agree with you. An hour, 15 minutes maybe. But you want to be cognizant of the fact that 4 hours sitting in a classroom isn't likely what they're looking for, any more than you're looking forward to 4 hours sitting in a dental chair, right? I mean, I'm not saying it to say most people would rather go to the dentist actually, but I've said many times.
The
So I
other
think,
thing you talked about, Larry, was if you have 15 people in a classroom, the probability of you engaging all 15 of those people is relatively low. Maybe half the people or just under half the people are really going to be engaged in that type of setting. But when you get small groups, the probability increases exponentially that you're going to be able to engage. You're going to be able to, impart some things on those folks that they're going to be able to use in real time. One of the things that I try to follow when I'm doing leadership training is not to ask leaders to do new tasks, but kind of take a look at the tasks that they're already doing on a regular basis, their toolbox talks, their regular engagements, and doing a little bit differently based on the leadership concepts that we talk about, or maybe the technical skills we talk about. So, not doing something new, but doing, making subtle changes, or maybe sometimes not so subtle changes to the things that you're already doing to maybe demonstrate your commitment to safety, or your commitment to, whatever the values are you're trying to, reinforce with your team. So that's another really, really good advantage of having those small groups, because you get a better feeling for what the individual's personalities are. You get a lot more time for each individual to talk, and you're going to learn an awful lot that's going to be, hugely valuable for you to be a successful coach by listening to people talk to you.
I agree. I got a lot of mileage out of that too, Peter, when I was doing this, with just being able to give these guys, here's some questions you can ask these guys that are bound to get them to think a bit. And then you can follow this up, right? It's not like you have to be able to deliver a motivating talk. You could just say to somebody, where do you think you're more likely to be in a car crash? On your way to work in the morning or on your way home? Where you're more likely to see one? Just things that make them think. What's the worst close call here you've ever seen? I mean, my favorite one was, being Canadian, if we had a hockey pool here and you could win $1,000 for predicting the next serious injury, I don't want to know who, but I want to know where and what shift, and how come. And, getting people to have to think about all of that stuff. And then you've got, from most of these guys, we're really good at being able to follow up that question. Well, why would you say planer feeder? And then I'd say, well, because when the pineapple goes, he goes, yeah, you're right. You ever worked that job? They were great at being able to now join in on that conversation. They just needed a few tools to kind of help them get all of that going. Sometimes, a little bit of go out there and sort of the three of you go talk to some people, you and the supervisor go talk to somebody and, show them how to get into one of these kind of conversations. Certainly, probably the easiest thing, I wish I had this at the beginning. The easiest tool though is rate your state. Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much rushing have you had to deal with so far today? How much frustration, how much fatigue, and, on a scale of 0 to 10, how complacent do you think you are right now? And then, the guy's like, what do you mean? I say, well, when was the last time you thought about getting hurt? And if he says, 5 years, well, you're probably a 9 or a 10. So, giving them, I found that, like, in terms of being gratefully receptive, like people thanking you, boy, you give them some tools that they could use. And that really, I found that probably more than anything else was what they really appreciated. Yeah, I liked your jokes in the classroom and it wasn't a drag, and your 4-hour dentist chair. Yes, I appreciated that. But the tools that you put in my hand, that's very much the way they are oriented too, right? Give me some good tools, give me a good set of wrenches and a good set, good Leatherman, especially this, that rate. I love that, and they can go out and they can really do a lot of good with that kind of stuff. Anything else just before we start taking a few more questions here, Peter, from the audience? And I know one thing I know we should talk about a bit is, because not everybody got to see the Safe Connection expert panel where, you and I were kind of moderating it, but the promoting the people from within and moving them around a bit, if there's any discretion there at the company. I remember thinking what Jason said from P&G was that, if at all possible, we move them to a whole new location, not just a new department, so that they get to kind of start off with a clean slate, everybody, but we keep a close eye on them to make sure everything's going okay. Any recommendations for companies around that as well too, so that there's less resistance to the new supervisor, or the new supervisor has an easier road?
Yeah, again, I'm going to be a little fuzzy lined on this one too, Larry, but I think there are benefits to both approaches, and I think it comes down to you promote somebody and have them supervise the team that they were just a part of, or do you move them to a different, maybe a different branch in the same building, or ideally a different building. And I think, from my standpoint, there are some certain, organizational advantages to keep someone with the technical skill and maybe even the institutional knowledge to stay in place and keep that operation running smoothly. And then from an individual standpoint, I think it would probably be easier for a leader to develop those soft skills that they need to advance as a leader if they go and work with a team that's not familiar with them. So, they don't have that baggage. So, I think that it really comes down to the balance between the technical skills of the individual and development of the interpersonal skills.
Okay. Both things, right? All right, Peter, I've got to get your 2 cents worth on this. What are the limitations, reasonable expectations? We talked about the fact that the good ones will be promoted quickly, that you probably should just accept that. That's a given. It's a good thing. We've got good people that we want to promote quickly. The weak ones will have strengths, they will have some strengths at least to build on. Serious weaknesses that constitute a real liability, you do need to deal with that. I mean, you need to know what gross negligence is as a supervisor, because you can go to jail for it. So if you tell somebody, don't bother locking that out, we're in a rush, if something happens, you could go to jail. I mean, or and worse. Yeah, you should go to jail. Never mind. But there's a bare minimum in terms of some of the legal stuff. Now, this is I always worry about this subject because I see so many safety people and everybody else just blaming all the problems on above. But if you don't have senior leadership help, if there's nothing there, what can you talk about that, Peter, in terms of, okay, what about when there is no real support from above? And does that, what would you tell a first line supervisor when you're hearing some stories, you probably know they're true, and you realize just how much between a rock and a hard place this person is? But that doesn't mean you should say, well, give up. I think you should go get another job somewhere else. So those are always options. But what do you do? What about when there is no real support from above? How do you work with them about that? Or how do you encourage them? How do you keep them motivated? Anywhere you want to go with that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe a topic for a whole segment. Larry. But what I can talk about my personal experience in that regard, and I think it's rare, at least in my experience, where senior leaders really don't want to support the front line. Although I will say that there are some times that that perception is there, if you know what I mean, and it may come from a variety of things. I think leaders, especially senior leaders, as we said earlier, they intuitively know the importance of those frontline supervisors and want to support them. And it may just be that they don't have a good strategy or a good vision of what that support looks like. So that may be perceived at the front lines as a lack of support, or that leader being in the in that between the rock and the hard place. So I think that a majority of the time it's going to be a perception. And I would, we said before the importance of not only leading your direct reports, but your peers. And this is the example where you've got to, be somewhat of a leader when you're interacting with your boss as well. And if it isn't a misconception, how do we solve that through communications and kind of knocking the hurdles down, right? And then if it is a true a true lack of support or some other type of conflict between that person and the leader, I would just encourage them to be positive, and nothing lasts forever. I think we've all had experience where we've worked for people that we wish we didn't have to work for them, but with time, things are more than likely to improve. So I would say just kind of continue to be yourself. Try to have the conversations with your leaders to clear up any misconceptions or misunderstandings. And if it is a true lack of support, then just continue to be yourself, continue to develop your skills, and do what you think is the right thing to do.
Well, I maybe one story I could remember is early on, and it's with a major railroad. They had a lot of rules, and I'm also in Quebec, which for those of you listening, it's in Canada, but it's it's a French province. I'm in Montreal, and so there's we wouldn't be like, you wouldn't call it tension or anything like that. Everybody there all got along. Everybody was bilingual except for me. It wasn't so much that. It's just I remember Denis Saint-Genis, and he was just talking about like the senior leadership. I mean, if I used a word pathetic, that would be the least of what he didn't use pathetic. Everything was above that. And it was a mixture of English and French profanity going on about the senior leadership. And I listened to this for, the whole cup of coffee, going, wow, this is really not good here. And I'm back to I'm only one genie, not three full-time, you talk about needing nine wishes to fix this place. And then he said, just a second, he said, I got to go get the cruise. I got to get the shift started. I'll be right back with you. And I walked out with him, and he literally saw one of his guys who wasn't wearing safety glasses, which was really common in this place. I mean, it was 100% eye protection, but you'd never know that by looking at the people. And he takes the guy aside, and I watched him for 5 minutes say to this guy, listen, they can make mistakes at the head office a mile down the road, and you and I can work our whole lifetime, and we'll never be able to make up enough money for the mistakes that they could make this afternoon. Don't ever do anything for this railroad that could get yourself hurt. Not for anything. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to them. You got to look after yourself first and foremost. And if you need anything from me to keep you safe, I'll get it for you. But I want you to put those safety glasses on. You understand? And I was just blown away. I would just listen to 20 minutes of, this is the most hopeless exercise in terms of safety he was even telling me, do you have lots of work? Because if you do, I'd go somewhere else, because you'd never, you're way out of your league here, sunshine. And then I watched him do that, and I knew that he got through to that guy. I just knew that he did. So I kind of thought, you know what? There's a real lesson there too, because you have more influence than any of those guys at headquarters will ever have on this person. And you can kind of blame it all up there, but it really is shirking. They're never going to be able to do what you can do. So you've got to, I don't know how you ever get people to sort of recognize that part, Peter, but I got to see it in a few supervisors when I started out, and I'd always try to tell other guys stories like that, saying, look, it doesn't really matter what you're up against. It's never going to be that 5 minutes it takes to lock something out properly that makes it or breaks it. It's never going to be, that. So, like you can really stop a lot, pardon the pun, a lot of the problems right here, as long as you get out there, and as long as you want to make sure these guys know that, if it takes a couple seconds longer, you got their back. So, I don't think that you should ever just throw your hands in the air and say it's hopeless as a first line supervisor either, because you do have an awful lot of influence right there if you can get them to realize it. Anything else though that you recommend? I mean, I have told a few of them to go get another job too, Peter. I don't know if you've ever done that.
I come to that sometimes. I've given people the same advice in the past, Larry.
Ever thought of getting that resume updated and just, seeing what's out there on LinkedIn or whatever? All right. So, yeah, I guess, it's not always that easy to fix your boss's boss, if that's what it takes. Mike, can you throw any of, I see one from, hi, Thomas Bergdorf. How important is learning emotional intelligence for being a leader supervisor as compared to acquiring technical skills? I think I almost know what you're going to say, Peter, is that it depends on how much technical. I've been listening so far, Thomas. The likelihood he's going to give you exact percentages is pretty low. But go ahead, Peter. Give us your 2 cents worth on that too, because I think I
don't see these two things as mutually exclusive, to be honest, Larry. I think that emotional skills, understanding human factors, if you will, internal states and all that, and how those affect the technical work that people are doing. I think, all right, you got me. They're equally as important, but I think that they're not mutually exclusive, if you will. Right? We always, look at technical systems in almost a binary fashion, and really where the value is understanding how the individual states, if you will, how individual human factors are going to affect the person interacting with those technical systems is where the real value is. Okay,
Peter, I got it. It's sort of timely, but it's leading into some of the new shows or some things we want to do next year about mental health. First came on my radar screen about 2 years ago. I was at a conference in Berlin, and it was somebody from the British construction industry talking about there was more suicides in construction in the UK now than there were workplace fatalities. And so I went, well, you can say whatever you want. A life's a life, and a death's a death, and it's all important to me. So it's not, are there some things that you would now recommend that companies do in terms of just 101, 202, recognizing mental health issues for supervisors? I mean, real basic stuff, but it was never, ever on the radar screen at all when I was training supervisors about, what to look for in terms of signs of depression, or what to look for in terms of, you know, somebody who may grab a gun and do something terrible. I mean, all that sort of stuff. Is there more of that now that you'd recommend folks at least get in front of their folks, their first line supervisors?
You know, I think one of the things that I could share, Larry, and you know, it's kind of direct or related to the Safe Start states. You know, for frustration, for example, you know, we understand that if somebody's working on something and it's not going well for them, they're going to get frustrated. And we kind of take that as, you know, we know that we can self-trigger on that frustration. But when you see people getting frustrated for no apparent reason, or getting frustrated more frequently, you know, those I think are the type of things where we can use our knowledge of human factors to, you know, and certainly not even insinuating that, you know, we're here to fix the problem, but what we can do is identify it and maybe get the person to the, you know, to the right, in the right direction to get help. But I think that with our knowledge of human factors, we can use that to identify someone that may, you know, may need someone that has a little bit different skill set to talk to, if you will. You know, same way with fatigue. If someone's coming in and, you know, you would expect someone to be fatigued at the end of a long shutdown or a long string of 12-hour shifts, but, you know, if someone, you know, seems fatigued for no apparent reason, there may be another opportunity to use human factors to see that there might be some, you know, some mental wellness things that we could encourage that person to seek help for.
Sorry, everybody. Believe it or not, somebody's sending me a fax. So that's talk about not quite a little out of date.
Is it coming from 1990, Larry?
Well, I don't know. It's somebody sending me a fax saying, you know, newsflash, first line supervisor training is important. I mean, we all know that. It's what do you do? How do you make it efficient? How do you maximize the effectiveness of it all? Follow it up so that there's actually some continuity and some stick to it, and overcome some of the problems which, you know, like no senior leadership support, are easy for you and I to talk about, but much more difficult if you're actually living it out there. And you can't get the stuff that you need, and you can't get a phone call returned, and so on, right? So, you know, it's Peter, I think it's first of all, thanks very much for all of this. I did see a question up there. So it seems like every BBS safety startup, regardless of who it is, there is a honeymoon stage, and then after a couple of years, everything drops off. How do you prevent that? And I think it's Frank Taylor. Well, Frank, I mean, I love the analogy because I think, you know, even though you have highlighted perhaps one of the problems with matrimony, I'm not saying there's a lot of problems with matrimony, but maybe there's more than one. People are still getting married, right? You know, and we still have behavioral issues to deal with. And the behavioral issues that end up causing the serious injuries and fatalities are all worth preventing, which is where it all started. Okay. So that certain BBS solutions are more efficient at the beginning than at the end is human nature. I mean, gyms base their whole business strategy on that we'll join in the first few months of the year and we'll quit going. I actually thought I was one of their best customers because I go almost every day. They said, no, you're the people. You cost us the most money. You wear the equipment out. You use the showers. You use the soap. You flush the toilets. I mean, the people who just sign up and never come here, Larry, they don't cost us any money at all. So, you know, that's human nature, that people kind of get going on something and they get some enthusiasm, they get some success. And then, although I'm going to sound like a broken record, they tend to get a bit complacent with it and they slack off. And, you know, that's typically the way it goes. Now, like the likelihood that any of us ever told you to slack off is pretty low. But, that doesn't mean that everybody takes our advice and keeps doing the things at a regular basis that we recommend. I mean, we even usually tell them stories about, here's what happens when you don't do this. Here's how much more difficult it is to try to resurrect it once you've let it go all the way to the ground. Here's some huge major companies and provincial utilities that have done it all over again because they figured out that rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency didn't go away just because they got rid of Safe Start or whatever else it was, right? So, and the same thing is true for, BBS, where you're going out and you're observing people, you're giving them feedback, you're talking about the job, trying to improve the job, either the front end or the back end. I mean, that stuff is going to get old after a while. Going to the gym gets old after a while. Getting on the treadmill gets old after a while. But as I said to this vice president once, it doesn't mean that it loses its efficiency. Okay. Like, you don't go to work because it's fun. You go to work because you have to. Well, some of these things, yeah, it's going to be a little more fun and entertaining at the beginning, but that doesn't mean you get to stop doing it. And that requires a certain amount of maturity within the organization, but if you don't do that, then what happens is you go flavor to flavor to flavor to flavor to flavor. And then pretty soon nobody at your workforce thinks that anything can stick here. So, you've got to kind of, you do have to kind of decide on what, we're going to stick with this and we're going to make it work. And we're going to recognize that after a period of time, it's not going to be novel anymore. And as you say, yes, the honeymoon period will wear off. That doesn't necessarily mean you should just go out and get divorced and give up half your wealth. But lots of people do. More of an explanation than that person probably bargained on, whoever it was. Any other questions there, Mike, or should I wrap this up? We're after the hour.
Coming on screen live for this one. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Pete. This was phenomenal. Your conversation's always a pleasure to be witness to. So, Larry, that's it. I think we're all good just to wrap now. Thanks.
Hey, just thanks, Brian Humphrey, the Peter principle. I think that was lovely for you there, Pete. Yeah, but thanks again very much for being on the show, Peter. Thanks for being on the Safe Connection Expert panel where we were discussing all of this. And maybe in the new year, we can sort of have you back on a special show where you could get into a bit more depth about, what it is, more specifically that we do, as you were saying, in the evaluation process, in the implementation phase, and also in the follow-up phase. So if somebody's really interested in the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty, or as Shane used to say, I want to look at this at the granular level, we can have you back for another hour in the new year, and you could sort of take us in for a little closer look at all of this, because certainly, the devil is in the detail exactly when it comes to this stuff, even in terms of the personality fit, the consultant and the company. It's that precise, but then the dividends are huge. Anyhow, everybody, I talk with Peter about this for hours. But we'll leave it for now, and have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Peter, and we'll catch up with you in the new year for sure.
Thanks for having me on, Larry. I really, really appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you in the new year. Thank you. Yeah. Merry Christmas,
Mike,
everybody.
Thanks very much, Mike, too. Okay. Bye, everybody. Oh, wait a minute. Next show is January 20th. Jimmy Quinn, he's the former president of IOSH. But he's not going to talk about IOSH, a little bit about IOSH and their initiatives and stuff. It's a International Occupational Safety and Health Organization. It's huge outside of North America, everybody. But Jimmy's personal background with big construction, managing big construction projects without a big stick, was what fascinated me when I was talking with him. And I actually said, Jimmy, I'd much rather hear you talk about this, and I'm sure our listeners would too, than to quite often, hear about, I mean, we want to hear a bit about IOSH. Yeah, I don't really want to hear about the bureaucracy though. I want to hear how it was back in the trenches when you did some, managing these mega projects without any serious injuries, without a big stick. That's something I think we all want to hear about. Anyhow, we're over time, everybody. Thanks very much. Really appreciate it. And again, Peter, thank you so much for your time, and Mike, and we'll see you all in the new year. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Larry.